The church in Bath stood solemn beneath a grey sky, its stone walls weathered by centuries of rain and prayer. Stained glass windows glowed faintly in the dim light, casting shards of colour across the wooden pews. Inside, the air was heavy with perfume, lilies, and unspoken judgment. Maureen Blackwood sat 3 rows from the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, 7-year-old Oliver swung his legs, the tips of his shoes brushing against the wooden bench. He was dressed in a little navy suit, the same one he had worn for his school portrait. Maureen had tied his shoelaces herself that morning, her fingers trembling more than his. She told herself she was here for him. He had insisted on saying goodbye to his father, Edward Blackwood, though he had never truly known him. The coffin at the front was closed, draped in white flowers. Maureen stared at it, searching for some trace of grief, but all she felt was the weight of eyes pressing down on her. Whispers followed her the moment she entered. Some mourners looked away, others did not bother to hide their disdain. She was the outsider, the ex-wife, the one Edward's family had marked as guilty long before the marriage had ended. His parents, Hugh and Margaret Blackwood, sat rigid in the front pew, their eyes fixed ahead, refusing even to glance at their grandson. When the organ began its mournful hymn, Maureen felt Oliver lean close. His voice was soft, curious. "Do you think Daddy can see us from heaven?" Her throat tightened. She brushed his hair gently, keeping her gaze on the coffin. "I think he would want to be here, darling. He would want you to be all right." But as the service continued, Maureen knew the truth. This was not going to be a farewell. It was going to be a reckoning. For when Clara Blackwood, Edward's younger sister, rose to her feet and stepped towards the podium, her eyes locked onto Maureen. And in that moment, Maureen realized Clara's speech would not be about grief. It would be about blame. Clara Blackwood's heels clicked sharply against the stone floor as she walked towards the pulpit. The sound carried through the silence like a gavel striking wood. Every head turned, and even the vicar seemed uneasy as she placed her notes on the lectern. Her voice was steady at first, filled with the rhythm of tradition. She spoke of her brother's youth, of summers in Cornwall, of how Edward had once dreamed of sailing around the world. But then her words shifted, the warmth dissolving into something harder. Edward, she said, her gaze fixed directly on Maureen, was a man who gave everything to the people he loved. He deserved loyalty, kindness, and respect. Yet he did not always receive that. The congregation stirred. Maureen felt Oliver lean against her arm, confused by the sudden change in tone. Maureen forced her expression to remain neutral, though her chest tightened. Clara's eyes glittered with something dangerously close to triumph. "He suffered," Clara continued. "He suffered not because of illness or chance, but because of betrayal. Betrayal from the one who vowed to stand by him." A ripple of whispers swept through the pews. Maureen lowered her gaze, but she could feel them, dozens of accusing eyes, pressing, waiting. Clara did not speak her name, but she might as well have carved it into the air. Oliver shifted beside her. In a small, puzzled whisper he asked, "Mummy, why is she looking at you like that?" Maureen placed a hand gently on his knee. "Just listen, darling. We will talk later." But inside, her heart pounded with fury. She had come here quietly, to give her son closure, yet Clara was determined to turn the service into a trial. And when Clara's voice rose for her final words, it left no doubt. "May we remember Edward not as a man broken by unworthy love, but as one who deserved so much more than he was given." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Then, slowly, Clara stepped down, her eyes never leaving Maureen. It was not grief that burned in them. It was vengeance. The vicar thanked Clara with a subdued nod, but his eyes flickered with unease. As he called for the hymn, the organ began to play, filling the church with mournful chords. Yet to Maureen, the music sounded like a cover, a thin veil stretched over whispers that buzzed behind her back. She could feel them. The women from the village, their heads inclined as though in prayer but their voices murmuring against her. The men with stiff collars and folded arms, turning to glance at her with narrowed eyes. Even the children, restless and fidgeting, had sensed the shift in the air. Maureen lowered her head, lips moving along with the hymn, though no sound came out. Her hands clutched the service booklet so tightly that its edges crumpled. Oliver sang in a small, bright voice beside her, unaware of the weight pressing down on his mother. His innocence was like a cruel contrast to the accusations that had just been spoken. When the hymn ended, Maureen dared to glance towards the front. Clara sat rigid, her posture like a blade, her face calm yet coldly triumphant. Every so often, Clara's eyes found hers, and it was not grief but judgment that burned there. The silence grew unbearable. Maureen thought of standing, of leaving, but she knew the act itself would be seen as guilt. And guilt was exactly what Clara wanted to paint across her. As the service drew on, memories clawed at her mind. She remembered Edward's final weeks, the shadows under his eyes, the bitterness in his voice, the way Clara had always lingered in the background, watching. There had been love once, yes, but it had soured, curdled into something poisonous. Still, the truth of what happened between them was not for the congregation to know. Not yet. The final prayer was spoken, and people rose from their pews, a soft rustling of coats and hymnals. The coffin, draped in white lilies, was carried slowly towards the graveyard. Maureen held Oliver's hand firmly, determined to walk the path to the burial. But even as she stepped forward, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. For outside the church walls, whispers had a way of becoming voices. And Clara was waiting for her chance to turn whispers into open accusation. The procession moved out into the cold daylight, where the air carried a sharp bite. The villagers gathered around the open grave, their shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The coffin was lowered slowly, ropes creaking under its weight until it came to rest in the hollow beneath. A hush fell, broken only by the flutter of crows in the trees that lined the churchyard. Maureen stood at the edge, Oliver pressed close against her side. His small hand clutched at her sleeve as though afraid she might slip away. She whispered a promise to him under her breath, though the words vanished into the chill air. The vicar recited the final rites, his voice trembling as he spoke. Maureen tried to focus on his words, but every syllable seemed to fade into the murmurs behind her. They were louder now, no longer whispers contained by wooden pews, but voices carried openly among the gravestones. She drove him to despair. She never truly loved him. It is her fault. Each sentence was like a stone hurled at her back. Maureen forced herself to keep her eyes fixed on the coffin, refusing to turn, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But then Clara stepped forward. Her black veil lifted slightly in the breeze, revealing eyes that burned not with grief but with a strange, icy certainty. She placed a single white rose upon the coffin, then turned, not to the vicar, not to Edward's grave, but directly to Maureen. "This is not over," Clara said, her voice low yet carrying across the silence. "We all know the truth, even if you will not admit it." The congregation shifted, a ripple of unease passing through them. Some looked down, avoiding Maureen's gaze, while others nodded faintly, as though Clara had only spoken what they already believed. Oliver looked up at his mother, confusion clouding his young face. Maureen's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed to speak, to defend herself, to tear down the lies then and there. But her voice would not come. It was as though Clara's words had wrapped themselves around her neck, pulling tighter with each heartbeat. And so she stood in silence, while the last clods of earth were thrown upon the coffin. Yet deep inside her, beneath the fear and humiliation, a spark of resolve flickered to life. Clara could turn a village against her, could tarnish her name, but Maureen knew there was a truth hidden in Edward's life and death, one that Clara was desperate to keep buried. And Maureen would not let it remain in the grave. That night, the cottage at the edge of the village seemed colder than ever. The fire sputtered in the hearth, throwing only a weak glow across the small sitting room. Marin sat hunched in a chair, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Oliver had fallen asleep on the sofa, his little chest rising and falling with each soft breath, a patchwork blanket tucked around him. Marin's mind would not rest. Clara's words at the graveside replayed again and again, a vicious refrain gnawing at her thoughts. She could not dismiss the way the villagers had nodded, the way some had looked at her as though she were a shadow of guilt walking among them. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Oliver, and moved towards the narrow hallway that led to Edward's study. The door creaked open, revealing the room that had once been his sanctuary. Books lined the shelves in ordered rows, his desk still scattered with papers, quills, and a cracked inkwell. Marin had avoided the room since his death. It felt too heavy, as though the air itself remembered him. But something drew her in now, an instinct she could not resist. She lit a small lamp, setting it upon the desk, and began to search. She opened drawers, sifted through bundles of correspondence, even leafed through his notebooks filled with sketches and half-formed thoughts. Nothing explained the unease that Clara had planted in her heart. Then, as her hand brushed against the rug beneath the desk, she noticed a faint unevenness in the wooden floorboards. Kneeling down, she pressed her palm against the spot. The wood shifted, just enough to reveal a loose plank. Her breath quickened. With trembling fingers, she prized the plank free. Beneath it, wrapped in cloth gone brittle with age, lay a bundle of letters tied with a thin ribbon. Marin's hands shook as she lifted them out, the dust rising in a soft cloud. The first envelope bore Edward's handwriting, but not addressed to her. She opened it carefully, the paper fragile, the ink slightly smudged. As her eyes traced the words, her heart lurched. My dearest C. The letter was filled with a tenderness she had not seen from Edward in years. Confessions of longing, of promises, of secrets shared in the dark. Marin's throat tightened. See, Clara. She dropped the letter, as though it burned her fingers, and clutched the edge of the desk to steady herself. The truth lay before her, undeniable and cruel. Edward had written love letters to his sister-in-law. The sound of the wind howled against the window panes, almost mocking her. She wanted to scream, to weep, but fear rooted her in silence. If Clara had these letters, or worse, if the village learned of them, her world would unravel completely. And yet, as Marin reached for the next letter in the bundle, something about the words caught her eye. There was a hint of desperation in Edward's tone, a sense of being trapped. He wrote of someone watching, of a debt unpaid, of threats whispered at night. Marin froze. This was no simple affair. She pressed the letters to her chest, her pulse racing. Edward's secret had been darker than she imagined, and Clara's shaming at the funeral had only been the beginning. For now, the letters were safe in her hands. But how long before Clara realized they had been found? Marin barely slept. The letters lay hidden in the drawer of her bedside table, tied once more with their faded ribbon. She lay awake listening to the wind against the cottage walls, every creak and sigh of the house sounding like footsteps outside her door. When dawn broke, a grey light spilled across the village, heavy with mist, and Marin rose with a resolve she scarcely understood. Oliver stirred as she dressed. Where are you going, Mum? He asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Just to fetch some bread from the baker, she whispered, forcing a smile. Stay here and keep the fire warm. But bread was the last thing on her mind. She walked swiftly through the cobbled streets, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. The village seemed hushed, as though the air itself kept secrets. Eyes followed her from windows. She sensed it, whispers chasing her steps. She turned down a narrow lane that led to the old churchyard, her heart thudding in her chest. If Edward had truly been writing to Clara, then the family's hatred for her was not jealousy alone, it was protection. They were hiding something darker. As she neared the church, she slowed. A figure stood by the lich gate, half lost in the fog. Marin's breath caught. At first she thought it was a mourner lingering after the funeral, But as she drew closer, the figure shifted into the shadows, as though waiting for her. Mrs. Blackwood. The voice was low, male, and unfamiliar. You should not go prying into matters that do not concern you. Maureen froze. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Who are you? She demanded, though her voice shook. The man stepped closer. His face was half obscured by the brim of a hat, but she caught the gleam of cold eyes. A friend of your late husband. He owed debts. Serious ones. You would be wise to leave his secrets buried. Debts. The word struck her like a blow. Edward's letters had spoken of them, warnings laced between his declarations. I have a child to protect, Maureen said, steadying her voice. If there are dangers that touch my family, I must know. The man tilted his head, studying her. Then you endanger the boy. Do you want him to suffer as his father did? Fear clutched her chest, but anger burned hotter. If you threaten my son, I will see the whole village know what Edward confessed in those letters. At this, the man's lips curled into a grim smile. Then perhaps it is time the village learns what you really are. Before Maureen could respond, he melted back into the mist, his footsteps fading until only silence remained. She stood trembling by the gate, the church bell tolling above her, the sound echoing like a warning. Maureen hurried home, her hands shaking as she barred the cottage door behind her. Oliver looked up from the hearth, his face brightening, but Maureen's heart was heavy. The truth was no longer buried, it was circling closer, like wolves at the edge of the firelight. And somewhere in the village, Clara Blackwood would soon realize that her brother's letters were no longer hidden beneath the floorboards. By evening, the mist had thickened into a damp shroud that clung to every roof and stone wall. The cottage was warm with firelight, but Maureen could not shake the chill in her bones. The stranger's warning repeated itself in her mind, each word sharper than the last. Edward's debts. Her son's safety. And the threat that the village might soon see her as something far worse than a grieving widow. Oliver sat at the small table with his sketchbook, drawing crooked shapes of trees and gravestones. Mum, he asked softly, why did Aunt Clara look at us like we were unwelcome today? Did I do something wrong? Maureen forced her lips into a smile, but her throat tightened. You did nothing wrong, Oliver. Never think that. Some people, they cannot see past their anger. That is all. The boy nodded, though his eyes lingered on her face as if he understood more than he should. Maureen looked away, her gaze drawn to the drawer where the letters were hidden. She knew Clara would not rest until she controlled every secret Edward left behind. And if the stranger's warning was true, Clara might not be working alone. A knock at the door startled them both. Maureen stiffened, her heart racing. At this hour, few called at the cottage. Oliver ran to open it, but she stopped him with a sharp whisper. Wait. Slowly, she unlatched the door herself. On the step stood Mrs. Hargreaves, the village seamstress, her shawl beaded with mist. Her expression was solemn. Forgive the intrusion, Mrs. Hargreaves said quietly, but you should know that Clara has gathered half the parish in her drawing room. She speaks your name often, and not kindly. They are saying Edward's ruin began with you. Maureen's stomach dropped. The noose was tightening. And what do you believe? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The older woman's eyes softened. I believe men make their own ruin. But the village, it hungers for a story to cling to. Be careful, Maureen. The storm is gathering, and truth alone may not shield you. When she left, Maureen closed the door with trembling hands. Oliver looked at her anxiously. Mum, what does she mean? Maureen knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. It means, my love, that sometimes people are quick to blame. But we must be strong. Stronger than their words. Yet inside, fear gnawed at her. If Clara had turned the parish against her, what hope did she have? Unless Edward's own words could defend her. unless the letters could be read before them all. But to reveal them was to risk exposing the debts, the shame, the darker truths she herself barely understood. The fire crackled, casting shadows that seemed to twist and whisper across the walls. Maureen held Oliver close, her eyes fixed on the flickering light. The night pressed hard against the windows, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Clara came knocking, not with whispers, but with an accusation no one could ignore. The church in Bath was packed once more, not with mourners but with villagers who had come at Clara's bidding. The air was thick with whispers, the stone walls echoing every cough and shuffle. Candles burned low, their wax dripping like tears. Maureen sat at the back with Oliver, her hands cold despite the heavy gloves she wore. She knew why she had been summoned. Clara meant to finish what she had started at the funeral. Clara stood at the front, her black dress sharp as armor. Her voice rang clear. "We gather not only to mourn my brother, but to face the truth of his downfall. Edward was ruined by betrayal, by the woman who calls herself his wife." Her eyes swept the room, resting on Maureen with venom. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Maureen felt every stare pierce her skin. She rose slowly, her voice trembling yet firm. "I will not stand by while lies are spoken. You claim to know Edward's truth, Clara, but you know nothing of the burden he carried." Clara's lips curled into a cold smile. "Then speak, Maureen. Show us all your innocence. Or is silence your only defense?" Oliver shifted beside her, his small hand tugging at her sleeve. "Mum," he whispered, "it's time." From his pocket, he pulled out the small USB Edward had given him before his final collapse. Maureen's heart thundered. She had promised herself she would never expose it, fearing what secrets it might hold. But now it was their only chance. The vicar reluctantly brought forward a laptop, and the image flickered onto a white sheet pinned against the stone wall. The room fell into tense silence as Edward's face appeared, pale and worn, yet unmistakably alive in the recording. His voice filled the church, weary but resolute. "If you are watching this," Edward began, "then I am gone. And you must know the truth. Maureen did not ruin me. I ruined myself. My debts were mine alone, my choices made in cowardice. I turned to drink when I should have turned to love. I pushed her away when she tried to save me. She is blameless. And if any of you dare to condemn her, you condemn me as well." The room froze. Every whisper died. Clara's face drained of color, her grip on the lectern tightening until her knuckles whitened. Edward's voice continued. "Clara, sister, I know you will rage at this. But you must live with it. The Blackwood name falls by my hand, not Maureen's. Remember that." When the screen went black, the silence was crushing. Then a murmur rose, not of accusation, but of shame. People turned from Clara, their eyes avoiding hers. Mrs. Hargreaves was the first to stand. "We owe Maureen an apology," she said firmly. One by one, heads bowed in reluctant agreement. Clara tried to speak, but her voice faltered. "Lies," she hissed, yet no one listened. Her power had crumbled with Edward's confession. Maureen held Oliver close, tears burning her eyes. For the first time since Edward's death, the weight lifted from her chest. She was not vindicated by her own words, but by Edward's. The truth was no longer a secret locked away in drawers and whispers. It was spoken, clear and undeniable, before them all. And as the villagers filed out in silence, Clara remained frozen at the front, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. Maureen knew this was not the end of Clara's hatred, but it was the end of her lies. The morning after the revelation, Bath seemed softer, as though the city itself had drawn a long breath and exhaled. The bells tolled gently from the abbey, carrying their sound through streets washed clean by night rain. Maureen stood at the window of her small flat, watching the mist lift from the cobbled lanes. Oliver still slept in the adjoining room, his small breath steady, his face peaceful in a way she had not seen for months. For the first time, the weight of suspicion no longer pressed upon her. The shame that had clung like a shroud was gone, swept away by Edward's final words. He had not given her a perfect life, nor a happy ending, but he had given her truth. And truth was enough. The villagers kept their distance, ashamed of their whispers, yet a few had begun to nod politely when passing her door. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. Maureen knew forgiveness would not come overnight. Yet she also knew she had no need for their approval anymore. She and Oliver had their own life to build, one free from the shadow of Clara's accusations. Clara herself had vanished from public sight. Rumors whispered of her retreat to the old Blackwood estate, curtains drawn tight, her voice no longer heard in the marketplace. Maureen felt no triumph in her downfall, only a quiet sadness. Hatred had consumed Clara, and now it kept her imprisoned more surely than any walls. As the sun broke through the mist, painting the rooftops gold, Maureen closed her eyes. She thought of Edward, not as the man broken by drink and despair, nor as the ghostly recording that had silenced a church, but as the young husband she had once loved. For all his failings, he had given her Oliver. And Oliver was her beginning. The clock chimed the hour. Maureen turned from the window, her steps light as she moved to wake her son. The day was waiting, and with it, the promise of something she had thought forever lost. Not absolution. Not victory. But peace.